Well, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to come back to a place that my wife and I lived for nearly 25 years. So, matter of fact, we've been gone so long, we got lost driving around here. When I wrote the introduction to the book, I tried to put it in a historical context to point out that the Chinese community in Irvine is part of a much longer history of Chinese who have been here since the early 1800s. And I want to try to contextualize that historically. But tonight I want to do something different. I want to look at it from a community perspective. Communities don't come into existence by itself. It takes organizing, it takes a lot of active people working together. So when you take a look at this book, I would encourage you not to look at these stories as stories about each individual or each organization. To borrow an image from the Dalai Lama, each of these stories and each of these associations are like pebbles. And when you throw those pebbles into the water, they will create their own ripples. But if you stand there long enough, you see the ripples of each stone beginning to overlap. And that's where the interaction comes from, and that's when communities start to be created. Okay. Now, I didn't see everything that was written, but I did see some of the stories. And the stories are put to Chinese in a very positive light, and this is good. We need to hear stories about what is possible. But we also need a fuller story about all the people, even those who worked on this particular volume, all the struggles that they had to go through. Let me just give one example. Gloria Dahlberg wrote a beautiful tribute to Linda Lau. Now, Linda Lau, when I first came to Irvine, was what I called a headhunter. I remember sitting in my office, I had only been in Irvine for 2 weeks, when I received a phone call from her. And she opened up the conversation saying, "Are you the distinguished professor from Harvard?" And I said, "No, I'm the undistinguished professor from UCLA." It didn't stop her. And she said, I'm so sorry. Can you tell me what you do? And I said, well, I do Asian American studies. And all of a sudden she said, can we get together for lunch? And I joined her for lunch. And before I knew it, I was involved in every activity that she was organizing. She started off with the Chinese Historical Society, and she had convinced me to put together a photo history of the Chinese in Orange County, which now sits in the Special Collections Archive at UCI. Then she went on to create the Multicultural Foundation of Orange County, which was an attempt not only to organize Chinese, but other ethnic groups, to talk about their history in conjunction with those of the Chinese. And part of that was creating a treasure chest of the different histories and cultures of the people who live here in Irvine County. And for that, she dragged my wife in. I told you, she's a headhunter. Okay? And my wife became the co-editor of that particular volume. Then she also put on fashion shows, and she organized one of the first multicultural festivals here in Irvine. An immense task. This is not reflected in that history that is there. But this is not the writer's fault. There was just not enough room to talk about all the things that any one person does. So when you think about this book, think about it in terms of community. Also think about it as an invitation, as a beginning to understanding much fuller the role of Chinese in this particular area. All your stories are important. As the president of the Southern California Chinese Cultural Association said, we need the elders to come out and talk to the younger people because they don't know. One of the assignments I used to assign in my introduction to Asian American Studies is to interview your parents. And the students always said, I already know everything there is to know about them. But when they started talking about them, they found out they didn't know a lot. Particularly for many Chinese of a particular period, there were a lot of secrets that they grew up in. And the secrets never came out until the kids really pressed them. So your stories are necessary to provide the continuity from the past to the present and to the future. So when we think of this book, think of it as an invitation to continue to participate, continue to build this particular community. I also want to point out, and what I used to say to my students when the class ended, I used to tell them, if you do not define yourselves, others will define you. And I can guarantee you, you won't like the way other people do it. And we have an ex-president who has shown how he defined the Chinese, and none of us like what we saw. So in order to preserve not only your identities and your history, you need to participate. You need to tell your story. You need to control the narrative. Okay. The other final thing I want to say is that the community here in Irvine is going to be constantly changing. What you see in the book now may or may not be here in another 50 years. The community is changing constantly, and I think many of you as parents have experienced that as you watch your children grow, and you realize they are never going to be the same type of Chinese that you are. I have 4 children. When they were going to college, I hoped all of them would marry Chinese. None of them did. Okay. And now they're raising children of mixed ancestry, and they're dealing with that identity. But they still feel part of the Chinese, the Asian American community. So that's the kinds of changes that we're going to be experiencing. Okay. And that's why projects like this cannot come to an end just with the publication of a book. It needs to continue, and hopefully you as the elders of this community will help that process along by telling your stories. So you are not only of the past, you are also the future. Thank you.